Can you guys hear me correctly? Fine? Yeah? No? Yes? All right, cool. So what I'd like to talk to you guys about today is the proposal We Are Digital Architects. It's a philosophy that I've been playing with for some time now. My reason for that is I believe as web designers, we borrow more conceptually from the world of architecture than we do from the world of graphic design, which has influenced our industry to no end. So what I'm going to be going through is, firstly, evolving our design language, looking at the words that we use and how that has an impact on the things that we create, looking at the language of the digital architect, and finally looking at our responsibilities. So without further ado, let's look at evolving our language. Now, there was an American comedian by the name of George Carlin who was quite controversial of his time, quite provocative. But one of his main shticks, his main theme that ran throughout his work was the words that you use and how sometimes you can say something but really mean something else. One thing that he said that was quite poignant was, we think in language, so the quality of our thoughts can only ever be as good as the quality of our language. And I think that really reigns true in our industry. If we look at the language that we use, it's mostly borrowed completely from the world of graphic design. So, above the fold, just completely copy and pasted. I mean, what exactly are we folding as web designers? Now, I know some people say you have to have content, and I understand that. But doesn't that affect the things that we're creating? I mean, if you're thinking that I'm going to put all of my important content at the bottom and shove all the rest of the crap, at the top and shove all the rest of the crap at the bottom, then is our information architecture correct? Surely we should be presenting the stuff we want people to see. Other sort of language that we use, which I think is wrong, again, because of the influence of graphic design, is the questions that we get. And we always go every year, should designers code? Yes, they should code. Why? I mean, when I hear this question, it's like, should artists mix paint? I mean, that just seems obvious. Should designers should be knowing how things work. And how can you possibly design in our industry if you do not know how to code? If we are going to be sincere in what we're trying to find out, the true question would be, who implements interaction or who creates production-ready code? That, I think, would answer the real problem. But because programming is seen as a very geeky thing, and it's almost used in a pejorative way, oh, graphic designers will look at the web guys, you're not a real designer, you write code. But that's just completely wrong. And I think that's affected us quite a lot. At the very least, you should know how to prototype. That's what I believe. I try to code a lot more. I'm not necessarily the best programmer, but I'm good enough to get the job done. And you hear the other debates, the native versus web, which is quite a controversial one. I always say, whatever works best. You should be looking at the problem you're trying to solve to your client, not trying to enforce an implementation detail in the beginning. Otherwise, you completely ruin the discovery phase of your projects. But if an award was to go to the most superficial of superficial, then the Oscar will have to go to this one. I hate this debate, and I know I have to make sure that I don't sound too ranty, because then I just seem like an angry guy running around on stage. But why? Why are we doing this? And it seems evidently clear that the word skeuomorphic people don't understand, and the word flat is just lazy. But just to give it a rundown, I'm sure most of you guys know what skeuomorphic is. But the problem I have with this debate is, firstly, they're not antithetical. You can't compare the two. It's like chalk and cheese, or as the Americans might say, crayon and cheese. So what is skeuomorphic? Or maybe not, I don't know. Skeuomorphic is imitating something that was functional in the original and applying it to your design, essentially. So a very simple example would be Polaroid photograph. Has a white border with the exception of the bottom, which is a lot thicker. Why? Because you don't want to damage the print with your thumb. And you take it out and you wave it like a Polaroid picture. Sorry for the pun. It's designed that way to protect the photograph. Now, if you look at, say, advertising, especially with travel websites, they'll take an image and they'll give it a white border. Why? Because it gives this image of spontaneity. It's just an image, it's not a photograph. But that would be skeuomorphic, because it's imitating something that was necessary in the original. Skeuomorphic is not texture. It's not realism. It's not emboss or embezzle. It's just imitation. And you do it for several reasons, to give a notion or a feeling or a sensation, depending on the thing that you're creating. So what is flat design? Well, flat design is a lack of dimension. Flat design is clean lines. Flat design is boring. That's a harsh stab at internet. I mean, I actually don't mind Microsoft. I think they have an amazing R&D department. But really, interestingly enough, they've now introduced the Start button back into Windows 8. No rant. I mean, if we were going to be sincere in the language, I mean, firstly, flat is a lazy term. By definition, isn't everything we create flat? I mean, if we were sincere, you could say the Bauhaus, pop art, Art Nouveau, at a push maybe block design, if we wanted to name after a stylistic treatment. But we went with flat. Graphic design terminology, which I'll explain in a second. Now, to stub the cigarette out, finally, once and for all of this debate, I want to show you this application, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, especially if you're on a Macintosh. It's called Stickies. Stickies is a purely skeuomorphic application. It borrows everything from sticky note paper, from the garish colors, to the way it snaps on the grid on your screen, to the discolored, really dark color across the top, because on sticky note paper you have glue, which makes it darker. It's designed to tell the user, this is for writing disposable notes. This is not for writing your PhD dissertation. Purely skeuomorphic. But hang on. Sorry, I'll stop doing that. I just got into the mode of TED. It's purely flat. Lack of dimensions, lack clean lines. So which one is better, skeuomorphic or flat? You can't compare the two. But we did, and we continued to do this because of the way graphic design has influenced our industry. And that's not a slur on graphic design. Up until the 1980s, graphic design was really typographic design. And then in the 80s, with the loss of grids, because grungy style fonts were coming about as a result of Ray Gun magazine and David Carson, who, unfair, but was partially responsible for a generation of designers not growing up with grids or knowledge of typography or the Swiss movements, because text went from being copy to just graphical images. And Eric Spiekermann, who is one of my type heroes, when he was asked the question, what would you consider yourself? And he said, a typographic designer. And the reason for that was he said a graphic designer has an idea in their head, like this page is going to look blue and wobbly. And they'll go out of the way to make it blue and wobbly. Replace blue and wobbly with flat, skeuomorphic, realism, whatever you may be. This is the mind state of a graphic designer in the modern world. Not all of them. The best ones are actually typographic designers. But we have to move away from that. Because designing in that way, you're starting from the outside in. Typographers and architects start from the center out. And that's where we have to move. I mean, think about it. We've all done this. I've done this so many times. We start with a nice, thick header. Then we'll do a nice designed footer. Then we'll chuck in a sidebar, which is really distracting, and copy and paste Lorem Ipsum, because our client's saying, I'll send you the copy at the end, and you can just upload it like, 1 past midnight. We're working from the outside. And it's very insincere. When a client comes to us to get us to solve a problem, and by problem I mean the brief, we're supposed to start with what is the message that they're trying to say? What are they trying to communicate? But if we're just coming up with these stylistic choices in the beginning or implementation details, we completely ruin discovery or any of the ideas that could make an amazing piece of design. So, with that said, what is the language of the digital architect? Well, to understand that, it's best to look at how architects speak. And there was an architect by the name of Louis Kahn, again, another American, pretty amazing buildings that he built, very stylistic, had a lot of soul. And he believed in talking to your materials in a kind of schizophrenic way. He would very literally pick up a brick and start having a conversation with it, because he believed it's important to honor the materials that you use. And in front of a classroom full of students, he'll pick up a brick and say, hello, brick, what would you like to be? And the brick will respond, I'd like to be an archway. Say, come on, brick, archways are expensive. How about I just pour concrete on you? What do you think of that? I'd just like to be an arch, please. What he was getting at is, in order to honor the materials, you have to understand them, because that's really important. And he exclusively used simple materials. Blocks of concrete at times, brick, and occasionally wood. He shunned all of the modernistic techniques because he thought they were soulless, because of the sort of postmodernistic style that was going on around the time, because he was from around the 1920s to the 1950s. And one of the buildings, which is quite iconographic, if that's the right word to use, is the Salk Institute. Now, one thing that's interesting about this building is the brief that was set for it was design a space where science and art can coexist, because the founders believed that ultimately science and art is the same thing. The difference is the application. It's all about discovery. And the building itself is a very functional building. Scientists and researchers can work quite well. But quite typical in Lewis Kahn's work is you'll find spaces which completely lead you into a different direction. You'll see a stairwell that invites you to look around, a bit like the way Easter eggs in our application work. It's like a discovery thing. And every now and again, you will find something that will make you look at things from a different perspective. Sorry, this is like a visual pun. But, and he did that all in his work. And the reason why is because he believed architecture was a thoughtful use of making of spaces. Every building had its own soul. And you could only achieve this by honoring the materials that you use. So what are our materials? Well, sadly, our materials are the ones which have been neglected the most. And that would be typography. Now, one thing that I like to do, again with this notion of starting from the inside out, is get all of the tags together, get all of my text elements, and start creating a design based on that. Because quite often, especially with web applications, what you'll do is if a client or another department will come and say, we need a new component, and they'll copy and paste elements together, and it'll completely break your stuff because you hadn't considered the type elements as individual blocks or the relationship between them. Some people call this a style guide. Some people call it style grid, perhaps. But what I'd like to do is eventually get a block of text, find a font which accurately conveys the message that I'm trying to achieve, or the client's trying to say with the message that they have. And then I start looking at the relationships. So that's just a simple example. The next thing is how does each element relate to another? Why would one element be 16 pixels or 1 EM and another element something else? Where do these arbitrary decisions come from? In architecture, they use something known as the golden ratio. I mean, just hands up, how many people are familiar with the golden ratio? Yes! This makes it so much easier. So the image is an example of the golden ratio. You take the smallest element, you times it by the golden ratio, you get the size of the next element. In Roman architecture, they used to do this a lot with their plinths. The reason being is because it was deemed aesthetically pleasing when you use this ratio between elements, because it appears in nature. You take your finger, you times that by the golden ratio, you get the size of that. I mean, this is just a magic number that appears. And typographers have been using this ratio as well as the Fibonacci sequence for the last 500 years, because typography is a 500-year art form. So what we do is we'll take the root size, say, I'm just saying 16 pixels. This is like the body copy. We're choosing the body copy, because that's the foundation element. And we times it by the golden ratio and get 26. Now, I know Jason's in the audience, and he hates pixels, and I'm completely convinced that the arguments he put forward completely convinced me, but in order for me to explain it, pixels just make more sense just for explanation purposes. We can convert this to EMs later on. So when we times this by the golden ratio, we get 26, and this gives us two potential numbers to use. The first one is a desired line height, and the second one is the next number in the scale. So if our body copy is 16 pixels, our subtitles or perhaps entry paragraph could be 26, depending on the design or the information we're trying to convey. And we keep doing that. Just keep timesing by the golden ratio. And we can go back. If you divide by the golden ratio, you get 10 pixels, or the EM equivalent. And just for EM conversion, that's there. But again, what makes us decide 16 pixels? There are other factors in typography which are really important to bear in mind. And primarily, it's the width of the column and also how many characters per line. Now, characters per line, or the line length, is a hornet's nest. There are many contradicting things. In the book Elements of Typography, it discusses between 55 characters per line to 75, depending on the font, or the typeface, rather. Actually, no, the font. Because every font has a different character width. So this was perfect when we were in fixed environments, because we could define the characters per width. And it was fine in print. But unfortunately, that happened. Well, I don't mean to be pejorative, it's just me just trying to be funny, but not. So responsive web design. In order to say, we want to say use 70 characters per line, it makes it very difficult if the column widths are continually changing. Coupled with the fact that if the column widths are changing, surely the font size should also be changing. Now again, this is a controversial idea that you would want to change the font size, especially of the body copy, quite a lot. But readability is important. The more words you have on a line, the harder it gets to follow to the next one. And we do have techniques to solve this. I mean, we have media queries. Again, I was in Jason's talk. It was amazing, as well as, I'm sorry, I know this isn't like a advertising, and also his workshop. And it really did convince me of why media queries were a good thing, but I still feel that they're hacky, because we're still thinking in fixed environments. We have thousands, potentially thousands of viewports now. Who knows what tomorrow will hold? So does that mean we keep adding more viewports? Is it not possible to design in a limitless space? Maybe a maximum width, perhaps, but I don't know. The other option that we have is viewport units. Now, does everyone know what a viewport unit is? Raise your hands. Okay. A viewport unit is essentially 1% of a percentage of the browser window. So 1 VW will be 1% of the browser width, viewport width. So what happens is, as you start scaling the browser window, the font size will change. Two problems with that: you lose the relationship between fonts, or between elements. The second thing is it's obviously very buggy because it's a new technology. So in WebKit browsers, it works, but in order to get the next size on a resize of a browser, you have to refresh. I mean, Chris Coyier came up with a hack where you change the z-index of an element to enforce the browser to redraw, but that required jQuery or JavaScript to do that. So it's not really a realistic option. So this got me thinking. And I started working on a prototype. Now, like I said, I'm not a developer. And this isn't production-ready code. This was merely an idea to test whether, if you could not design according to the viewport, but design according to the column the text sits in, coupled with the fact that you want a certain amount of characters per line, and you want a relationship between all of the elements. So I made this. Now this is, again, this is very experimental. So you have your element, the text is being set according to the width. What happens is we find what the ideal font size should be based on how many characters we set per line we set, and then we do some math to figure out what the golden ratio is. So then what happens is, if I resize, all the font size change. And if I go back down, they'll change. Because what we're looking at is the column widths. It's the column widths that are important. Now, we could have a maximum font size or a minimum font size, because obviously it might get a bit insane if you have very large columns. But this prototype takes characters per line into consideration and would require a bit of tweaking. The other thing is, handing over all of our design choices to the machine seems like a very dangerous thing. So this got me thinking. We don't really have the tools to do typography to the degree that we would like, or I would like. And I think the reason for that is no typographer has, as far as I know, has ever sat on the W3C panel to figure out the technologies. I would like characters per line to be a CSS attribute. I think it's really important. A maximum characters per line, minimum characters per line, I think that would be fantastic, because then we could start designing type, because we're not. For now, media queries works very well to do the things that we want to. But it still bothers me. It still bothers me that we can't fully embrace the responsibilities. And typography is a big responsibility. It is, people spend their lives designing a single font, or typeface rather. And I think just to honor that, it's really important. But we have many responsibilities. Again, to explain the other responsibilities we have, one of many, we go back this time 400 years into the past, to the chief head architect of the Ottoman Empire, by the name of Mimar Sinan. Now, Sinan believed in validating everything that he designed. And there's a really nice story that I'm going to tell you guys. But he believed in taking inspiration from everything. He said, I saw monuments and great architect remains, and from every ruin I learned something. For every building I absorbed something. And I think we can do the same thing. Instead of just looking at graphic design and saying, right, we have to interpret this analog design style into something digital, we can look outside of that. That's why I'm architecture, because it's completely different in practice, but if you think about the language of the architect, it really does apply. We have to make spaces too, spaces which people navigate from. One of the buildings, and he designed approximately 300 buildings, was the Süleymaniye complex in Istanbul. Now, this building originally was designed to be a mosque, schools, like multiple schools, baths. Mosques in those days in the Ottoman Empire were pretty much like town hall buildings. This is what it looks like today. Now, the problem he had when he was designing this building was light. During the day, it was fine because you could position windows in certain places, but at night, it required oil lamps. And these oil lamps suspended from the ceiling. But there was a problem with them, and they created a lot of smoke. So the story goes, the Sultan is going to visit his chief architect to see what's going on. And in the middle of the building, all he sees is his architect smoking a peace pipe. And he said, what the hell are you doing? And he said, testing the airflow system. See, what he had done is he had positioned several holes throughout the dome and around the building, which led to an upper room above the main doors, known as the workroom, which collected all of the smoke. As well as that, at the end of each of these holes, there would be paper shaped like ice cream cones, which would collect the soot. This was the second part of the design. The reason why he was collecting soot was because if you mix that with water, you get a pigment known as lamp black. And lamp black is what scribes used to write in the old days. It's also one of the world's most permanent inks, so if you get it on your clothes, you're not getting it out. A two-functional piece which nobody notices, because the experience people have is clean air. People never notice good experiences, but they will notice the smoke. And he was testing these ideas, and the same way that we would be testing our ideas. You come up with a concept, you put yourself in the position of how does this work in context, and then you can really understand the thing that you're creating. So Sinan was trying to understand the problem 400 years ago. He was prototyping, a bit like Agile. Now, Agile is a bit of a contentious one recently because one of the developers who developed or came up with the idea for the Agile manifesto said, death to Agile, long live agility, because Agile's kind of become like a marketing term. Designers typically don't like Agile because, well, firstly, it means something different to everyone. And secondly, it's fundamentally a developer process, or that's how we perceive it. The way I like to think of this iterative process is, again, if you look at, say, like an artist. Now, I did fine art at college. Now, the tutors used to say to us, when you're painting a picture, you first start with lots of blobs. Illustrators do this all the time. They'll draw sausages. The next thing you'll do is start to sculpt in the perspective between elements. Then you start doing the low lights, then perhaps the medium lights, highlights, and then you start painting the details. You'll do this in stages. Why? Because if you start painting something detailed in the beginning, it will look completely different elsewhere. Sculptors do that, obviously. They'll start chipping away a block. And I think this is how we should design things. Because the digital graphic designer would open up Photoshop, do the design, send it to the client, job done. But really, that's the beginning of the design process. We have to be iterating. And that's really uncomfortable for the design world. And validating our ideas is really uncomfortable too. So we all do this. The first thing is we'll come up with ideas. I say, step away from the computer as soon as you get a brief. You have to be thinking about drawing. And drawing helps free from yourself from thinking in Photoshop or Sketch or any of these fixed pixel dimensions. you start free-flowing your ideas, and you can do this with non-designers as well, and everyone can understand what's going on. And we all kind of do this, sketchpads, mood boards. The next thing is prototyping. Now, this is something that not all of us do, and we should. We need to be prototyping everything. We need to be validating everything that we do. So typically, when we do prototyping at the company I work called Digital Science, we might use Bootstrap and Foundation just to get an idea of UI elements. So it's like designing in the browser. Sometimes we'll use Agile, which helps design flows. Who uses Agile in this room? Okay, quite a few. For those of you who don't, it looks like Flash, but generates HTML, or rather Flash 4. But it really helps understanding the flow of getting from A to B. It really helps. So for example, when we were designing an application for digital science, I started putting all these dialog boxes everywhere, because that just made sense when I was just making the mock-ups. And when I started running through the flow, I was thinking, wait a second, why am I doing this? Why am I continually asking my users questions? Because every link, input element, you're basically asking the user to choose something. Really, it should all be seamless. Why would we be asking? And creating prototypes, testing the code, or just getting something that's very hacky really helps you to design things, not from a UI perspective, but from an experience. Marvel App is a new one. It's in beta. It's a really lovely application and can be used by anyone. It requires no programming skills whatsoever. The way it works is you can take images of your design. So if you're doing sketches, you can take photographs, connect it to your Dropbox account in a folder, and what Marvel App will do is in the application you can create click-through prototypes. And Marvel App will generate a link for you. The great thing is, because it's all linked to Dropbox, if you change the image, it will update the link on the fly. So you could be speaking to a client on the phone saying, what do you think of this? And they'll be on their iPhone because it also supports touch. What do you think of this design? Say, no, I don't like this. Could you make it like this? So, okay, fine. Let me just quickly do it. Boom, it's done. Marvel App is really cool. And I mean, it's still in beta. They're still developing some of their ideas, but I really recommend that because anyone can use that. The next thing we do is the thing that horrifies all designers, and that's testing. Because we're supposed to be magicians. We create this work, no explanation. It just works. We don't like being questioned because how dare you insult our design integrity? But we're not digital graphic designers. We create spaces that should be tested continually. So what we like to do is we'll create some prototypes, and we'll literally get the people that we work, the clients that we want to work with, and run it through them. So we work typically with scientists and researchers. So we'll speak to them. What do you think of this? Does this make sense to you in your environment? Are we understanding the problems that you have? Sometimes we'll actually go, before we've designed anything, is try to get an understanding of what is it that the scientists are trying to achieve. And then create prototypes and then present them again. And it's kind of like a back and forth thing. And then when we find something that we think works, then we'll present it as a potential product to create. And that really works. It makes the users feel empowered, and it makes us really understand that we're creating something that is useful. The next thing we do, or some of the other things we do, is surveys. That's a tool that you can use to create them. It's quite expensive. There are other surveying tools, but it really works. Now, surveying and asking questions is not something that designers typically, or most people typically, don't know how to do. Because it's very easy to write leading questions and get the wrong information and have that inform your design. So you have to be very careful what you're asking and to whom, because then you just skew up your research and data. But again, the idea is having the conversation with the people that you want to create for. The next thing is A/B testing. Does everyone know what A/B testing is? Yeah, cool. For those of you who don't, A/B testing is getting two designs and presenting 1 to 50% of your audience and another one to the other, and basically seeing how the flow works, seeing which one works better. Like Optimizely was spoken about by Sarah this morning. It's a very cool tool. And this is where the designing and iterations, because sometimes the first thing you do, with all the information that you have, still might not hit the space that you want, still might not get your metric or the goal that you're trying to achieve. Optimizely helps you to refine that and continue to iterate. And remember, the things that we create are not dead things, they're continually living. So you have to treat them like that. There's too many websites which are just decomposing online. Iteration, iteration, iteration. And then we can really create beautiful experiences. So to summary, or to summarize rather, we need to ignore the superficial language which is affecting our industry, because we do thinking language. And it affects the things that we create, which is why we, for so long, lived in a fixed pixel world when really we should be doing responsive, like the first ever web page was back in '94, was purely responsive. But we made these rules. We imposed these things on top of ourselves. We are the ones who decided to use Photoshop. We made those choices because of the language we were using. We need to kind of break away from that. And that does mean creating new tools. Like Typecast is an amazing tool for typography. It is Typecast, right? Yeah. I always confuse it with Typekit because of the word type. It's on the right path. That's where we need to be moving to. We're not in static environments anymore. The next thing is we need to be a bit more schizophrenic and start having conversation with our tools. We need to really understand what we're trying to represent and what we're trying to create. And finally, we need to test and validate our ideas to prove that it's not just this mythical art. There is a science behind it. Because we are digital architects. But the whole point of this talk is about really three things, and it's about embracing discovery. If we start having these ideas beforehand, like the flat or the blue and wobbly or whatever, it really destroys that. Because the process is this, it's uncertainty, discovery, and then you get to creating something. And it's really important that we don't ruin the uncertainty. The uncertainty can make you physically sick. Like Stefan Sagmeister, he says that unless he has that sick feeling in the pit of his stomach, he knows he's not into a good thing. So if he has that feeling, he knows he's doing something right. Because it's that uncertainty that will really make you think clearly about the thing that you're creating. It will really make you think. And then once you've thrown up a few times, you start discovering new things. You start thinking about the problem, as in the brief that you're trying to solve. And that's when you're in the creative process. Like John Cleese of the Monty Python said, there's nothing more liberating than a blank sheet of paper. And it's true. And I think we need to embrace that too. Thanks.